A Christmas murder in Foxglove End was the sort of village that appeared, at first glance, to have been arranged by a benevolent hand expressly for Christmas cards. It lay in a shallow fold of the Hampshire countryside, sheltered from the harsher winds by low chalk hills, and bordered on one side by a narrow stream that wandered lazily past water meadows and vanished beneath a small stone bridge. In December the hedgerows were bare, the fields silvered with frost in the mornings, and the air carried that particular stillness which came when winter settled in with quiet confidence. The village green, modest but well kept, lay at the heart of Foxglove End. Here stood the parish church of St. Bartholomew's, its grey tower softened by age and ivy, and opposite it a row of cottages with latticed windows and doors painted in cheerful colours. At one end of the green rose Foxglove House itself, a substantial Georgian residence of mellow brick, its symmetry slightly softened by creeping roses long since stripped of bloom. Christmas was approaching, and Foxglove End was preparing in the manner it always did, with determined cheerfulness and a good deal of gentle rivalry. Wreaths appeared on doors, the Women's Institute debated the correct proportion of spices in mincemeat, and the vicar's wife could be heard reminding anyone who would listen that last year's nativity costumes had been quite unsuitable for a donkey. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her accustomed armchair by the window of her own neat sitting-room, observed these preparations with quiet satisfaction. From her vantage point at Rose Cottage, she could see the lane that led towards the green, and few movements escaped her attention. She was knitting something soft and pale blue, intended for a great niece, but her eyes were alert, her mind gently active. Christmas, Miss Marple reflected, had a way of making people behave rather badly. Expectations ran high. Resentments long suppressed had an unfortunate tendency to surface. She had observed it time and again, not only in St. Mary Mead, but in villages very much like it. Foxglove End, she thought, would be no exception. She was staying there at the invitation of her old friend, Mrs. Eliza Trent, a sprightly widow who had lived in Foxglove End for over 40 years, and insisted that the village was quite the nicest place to spend Christmas, far better than London with all its fuss. Mrs. Trent occupied one of the cottages near the green, and delighted in village gossip with an enthusiasm Miss Marple found both familiar and, at times, useful. That particular afternoon, Mrs. Trent arrived in a flurry of cold air and excitement, removing her gloves with unnecessary vigour. "My dear Jane," she said, settling herself down without waiting to be asked, "I have the most extraordinary news. You will be fascinated." Miss Marple smiled politely. "I so often am, Eliza. It's Foxglove House," Mrs. Trent continued, lowering her voice, though no one else was present. "They're having Christmas there this year, all of them, Miss Marple repeated mildly. "Yes, the family I mean, Sir Reginald Hawthorne and his brood. They don't usually come down in winter, you know. Too cold, too damp too, too village, like, I imagine, but this year they're descending upon us in force." Miss Marple's needles paused for a fraction of a second. Sir Reginald Hawthorne was the owner of Foxglove House and a man of some local importance. A retired industrialist, he had made a considerable fortune before the war, and had since acquired a reputation for stern efficiency and a certain lack of patience with human frailty. "I suppose Christmas has its sentimental claims," Miss Marple said. Mrs. Trent snorted. "Sentimental is hardly the word I'd use for Sir Reginald. Still, they're already here, or some of them are. His daughter, Clara, arrived yesterday, and the nephew, what's his name, Andrew. The vicar says the others are expected any day now." Miss Marple nodded. Families gathering at Christmas were, she knew, fertile ground for discord. Over the following days Foxglove End grew steadily busier. Cars appeared in the drive of Foxglove House. their arrival noted and discussed with interest. Miss Clara Hawthorne, a handsome woman in her late 30s, was seen walking briskly on the green, her expression resolute and her clothes impeccably tailored. Andrew Hawthorne, younger and less self-assured, had been spotted at the post office, fumbling for change and blushing furiously when corrected by Mrs. Peake on the price of stamps. There were others too. Mrs. Daphne Morley, Sir Reginald's widowed sister-in-law, arrived laden with trunks and an air of delicate grievance. Then came Leonard Pike, Sir Reginald's secretary, a thin, precise man with horn-rimmed spectacles and the habit of observing everything from behind a polite, unreadable smile. Miss Marple, encountering these individuals separately and in passing, took note of small details: the tension in Miss Clara's shoulders, the nervous eagerness of Andrew Hawthorne, the faint sharpness beneath Mrs. Morley's soft voice, the secretary's careful discretion. Each reminded her, in some small way, of someone she had known before. The village was invited to Foxglove House on Christmas Eve for what Sir Reginald termed a modest gathering. In practice, it proved neither modest nor informal. The great hall was decorated with holly and candlelight, a tall Christmas tree standing proudly by the staircase. Tea and sherry were dispensed with efficiency, and Sir Reginald himself moved among the guests with stiff courtesy. Miss Marple attended with Mrs. Trent, observing quietly from a corner near the fireplace. Sir Reginald, she noted, looked tired. His once commanding presence had diminished. His face was drawn, his temper noticeably short. "You must forgive the confusion," he said sharply to Mrs. Peake, who had dared to ask about the mince pies. "These arrangements were not of my choosing." Miss Clara stood nearby, her lips pressed together, while Andrew Hawthorne hovered uncertainly at the edge of the room. It was during this gathering that Miss Marple first noticed a certain undercurrent of strains, small exchanges cut short, glances heavy with unspoken meaning. Mrs. Morley wept quietly in one corner, comforted by Leonard Pike, while Miss Clara argued in low tones with her father near the staircase. Miss Marple sipped her tea and thought of Christmases past. There were patterns here she recognized all too well. 2 mornings later, on the 23rd of December, the stillness of Foxglove End was shattered. Miss Marple was midway through her breakfast when she heard the sound of hurried footsteps outside, followed by insistent knocking at the door. It was Mrs. Trent again, her face pale beneath her hat. "Jane," she said breathlessly, "it's Sir Reginald. He's dead." Miss Marple put down her teacup with care. "Dead," she repeated. "How very sad. They found him at the bottom of the staircase at Foxglove House. They say he must have fallen in the night, broke his neck, apparently." Miss Marple rose slowly. "A fall on the staircase. How familiar that sounded. Accidents did happen, of course, particularly in winter, particularly to elderly men. And yet, there's more," Mrs. Trent added, her voice trembling. "The doctor says it's all rather odd." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "In what way?" "Well, Sir Reginald was known to be careful, very careful, and there was talk of an argument the night before. The servants heard raised voices. Miss Marple took her coat from the peg by the door. "Then I think," she said gently, "that Foxglove End is about to have a very different sort of Christmas." As she stepped out into the cold morning air, the bells of St. Bartholomew's began to ring for morning prayers. Their sound drifted across the green, solemn and insistent, as though marking not only the season, but the beginning of something far more troubling, excitement and hushed speculation. The news of Sir Reginald Hawthorne's death had travelled with remarkable speed, conveyed from cottage to cottage in murmurs and meaningful pauses. By the time Miss Marple set out for her customary walk, she could feel the village holding its breath. The house at Foxglove End had already taken on that peculiar stillness which followed sudden death. Curtains were drawn, the drive unusually empty, and the cheerful trappings of Christmas now seemed incongruous against the gravity of events. Miss Marple approached the house in the company of Mrs. Trent, who spoke in a low voice, as though fearful of being overheard by the frost-laden hedges. "They say it was an accident," Mrs. Trent said, "a terrible misstep on the stairs. Still, you know how people talk." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, "and sometimes they talk for a reason." Inside, the atmosphere was tense but orderly. The local police had already been, and Dr. Wilton, the village physician, was conferring quietly with Inspector Mallory, a solid, competent man with a face weathered by years of service in rural districts. He greeted Miss Marple politely, though with a hint of surprise. "I understand you're staying in the village, Miss Marple," he said. "An unfortunate business." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, "unfortunate in so many ways." The staircase in question dominated the entrance hall, a wide, sweeping structure of polished wood, carpeted and fitted with a sturdy banister. Sir Reginald had been found at its foot in the early hours of the morning by the housemaid, Ellen Briggs, who had raised the alarm at once. Miss Marple studied the staircase carefully. There were no obvious signs of disturbance, no broken ornaments, no scuffed marks suggesting a struggle, and yet, she thought, appearances could be deceiving. She had seen many a carefully arranged scene in her time. One by one, the members of the household were spoken to. Miss Marple, seated unobtrusively near the hall, listened attentively. Miss Clara Hawthorne was the first. She spoke calmly, though her eyes betrayed fatigue. "My father was not in the best of health," she said. "He insisted on remaining independent, of course, but I had urged him to take more care." "Were you with him the evening before his death?" Inspector Mallory asked. "Yes, we spoke after dinner. There was a disagreement. The inspector prompted. Miss Clara hesitated about family matters, financial arrangements." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly in her handbag. Financial disagreements were rarely trivial. Andrew Hawthorne, when questioned, was visibly nervous. He twisted his hands together, avoiding the inspector's gaze. "I went to bed early," he said. "I didn't hear anything." "You didn't hear raised voices?" the inspector asked. "Well, perhaps, but it wasn't unusual. Uncle Reginald could be forceful. Mrs. Daphne Morley, draped in black despite the proximity of Christmas, was more forthcoming. Reginald had enemies," she declared softly. "He made a habit of it. He could be cruel without meaning to be." "And you?" Inspector Mallory asked gently. "Did you quarrel with him?" Mrs. Morley's eyes filled with tears. "We disagreed, yes, about my allowance. He wished to reduce it." Miss Marple observed the slight tightening of Leonard Pike's mouth at this revelation. When the secretary's turn came, he spoke carefully, his words measured. "Sir Reginald was under considerable stress," he said. Business matters weighed heavily on him. He had recently revised his will. At this, Miss Marple's interest sharpened considerably. Revised his will. Inspector Mallory repeated, "Yes, only a week ago." The inspector made a note. Miss Marple folded her hands, thinking of past cases in which such revisions had proved provocative. Throughout the morning, small details emerged. Ellen Briggs admitted to hearing voices on the stairs late at night. The cook mentioned that Sir Reginald had taken a glass of brandy before retiring. Dr. Wilton remarked in a cautious tone that while the injuries were consistent with a fall, the circumstances were unusual. "It's possible," he said, "that he was disoriented." Miss Marple considered this. Disorientation could arise from many causes. As the household dispersed, Miss Marple found herself walking beside Inspector Mallory. "I trust you'll forgive my curiosity," she said gently, "but may I ask, do you truly believe it was an accident?" The inspector smiled wryly. "I've learned not to make up my mind too quickly, Miss Marple, but I will say this. The more I hear, the less straightforward it seems." Miss Marple nodded. That, she thought, was a promising sign. Over the next day she set about her own quiet investigation. She spoke with Mrs. Peake at the post office. who mentioned that Miss Clara had been making inquiries about travel arrangements. She chatted with the vicar's wife, who recalled hearing raised voices from Foxglove House late on the night of the 22nd. And then there was a bang. The vicar's wife said, quite a loud one. Miss Marple thanked her and walked on, her mind busy. She visited Mrs. Trent, who had already compiled a remarkably detailed account of village opinion. They say Miss Clara wanted the house sold. Mrs. Trent whispered, and that Andrew was desperate for money, and that Mrs. Morley feared being turned out altogether. And Mr. Pike, Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Trent pursed her lips. Hard to say. He knows everything, that one, everything. Miss Marple smiled faintly. She had known secretaries like Leonard Pike before, men who appeared indispensable and who often were. By Christmas Day the mood in Foxglove End was decidedly altered. The church was still full, the carols sung with customary enthusiasm, but beneath the surface ran a current of unease. Miss Marple, seated in her usual pew, reflected on how death had a way of rearranging relationships. After the service, Inspector Mallory approached her again. "We're holding an inquest in a few days," he said. "Until then, we proceed cautiously." "Quite right," Miss Marple agreed. "Caution is always advisable." As she walked back to Rose Cottage, she paused by the green and looked towards Foxglove House. Snow had begun to fall lightly, settling on the bare branches and the silent windows, a fall on the staircase. An argument in the night, a revised will. Miss Marple thought of a young girl she had once known, who had slipped on a stair not by accident, but because someone had removed the carpet rod. The memory lingered unpleasantly. "There are patterns," she murmured to herself, "always patterns." And somewhere within Foxglove House, she felt certain, one of those patterns was beginning to reveal itself. The snow lay thick over Foxglove End, blanketing the hedgerows and the fields in a gleaming white. Yet the village itself felt far from peaceful. Whispers and half-glances followed Miss Marple wherever she went, and the sight of Foxglove House rising above the green, its windows darkened, seemed to warn her that nothing would be simple. Miss Marple's first visit of the day was to the house itself, at the polite invitation of Miss Clara Hawthorne, who had insisted on tea in the library. The room smelled faintly of cinnamon and polished wood, but there was an edge to the air that suggested unease rather than festivity. "I hope I am not imposing," Miss Clara said, offering a polite smile. Her hands were gloved, though the fire flickered cheerfully. "It is so hard to think of Christmas while this has happened. Do not trouble yourself over politeness, my dear," Miss Marple replied. "We must talk frankly." Miss Clara hesitated, then began in a low voice. "Father, he had secrets. I cannot explain them all. But he feared certain people, and there were arguments, disagreements, well, they were more serious than I ever imagined." Miss Marple inclined her head. "And these disagreements, do they concern money, family, or perhaps matters of the heart?" Miss Clara's cheeks flushed. "All of them, I suppose. My brother Andrew, he was impatient. He believed father would bequeath him more than was proper. And my Aunt Daphne, she was anxious about her allowance. They all seemed protective of their interests." Miss Marple made a note in her mind, as she always did. In families, protection of self-interest often concealed far more subtle current, envy, resentment, and occasionally malice. It was during that same afternoon that Miss Marple encountered Leonard Pike once more. He was in the drawing-room, ostensibly arranging the telegrams and letters that had accumulated since the accident. He looked up with his usual calm and precision. "Miss Marple," he said, "I hope my presence here does not inconvenience you." "Not at all," she replied. "In fact, I am quite glad to see you. You have been with the family for some time, have you not?" "Yes, many years," he said. "I am, of course, concerned about the current situation. It is unsettling." Miss Marple studied him carefully. His hands were steady, his voice even, yet there was a subtle tightness in his jaw. The sort of subtle tension that comes when a man knows more than he should reveal, or perhaps fears being misunderstood. "I wonder," she said casually, "about your knowledge of the house. You have seen the family through many crises, have you not?" "Yes," he admitted, "though I cannot claim to know their hearts completely. People hide their hearts very well." Miss Marple allowed herself a small smile. She knew that particular truth better than most. She also knew that those who claimed ignorance were often the most aware. Later, in the small parlour of Rose Cottage, Miss Marple met Mrs. Trent, who had returned with a sheaf of observations and gossip. The village, it seemed, was busy spinning stories to fill the silence left by Sir Reginald's death. "Did you know," Mrs. Trent whispered, "that Andrew was seen leaving the study late at night, and that he carried something small and shiny, they say?" Miss Marple considered this. "Small and shiny?" she asked. "Yes, a letter-opener, perhaps, or a paperweight. No one is sure, but it seems odd, does it not? Very odd." Miss Marple agreed. "And yet appearances are often misleading." By now, Miss Marple had begun to draw mental maps of the household's movements, noting subtle inconsistencies. Miss Clara claimed to have spoken to her father after dinner, yet Andrew's movements suggested he might have been alone in the study at the same time. Mrs. Morley insisted she had retired early, yet the cook overheard faint voices from the corridor. Leonard Pike, for his part, appeared composed, but never let his gaze wander, observing all without comment. On Christmas Eve afternoon a further complication arose. A letter, marked urgent and addressed to Sir Reginald, had been discovered on the desk in the study. It was unsigned, yet its contents suggested blackmail, a demand for money under threat of scandal. Miss Marple read the lines carefully, noting the language, the choice of words, the hints of familiarity. "This," she murmured to herself, "changes certain things considerably. The letter implicated someone who had close knowledge of the family's private affairs. Someone who could anticipate Sir Reginald's reactions and who understood the value of subtle intimidation." The possibilities narrowed quickly in Miss Marple's mind. As night fell, the household gathered for a subdued dinner. The fire glowed faintly, casting shadows across the faces of those present. Miss Clara's composure wavered, Andrew fidgeted nervously, Mrs. Morley dabbed at her eyes, and Leonard Pike remained calm, a sentinel of silent observation. The servants exchanged whispers behind closed doors. The atmosphere was thick with tension, heavy with suspicion. During dinner, a minor incident raised eyebrows further. A tray of dessert had been disturbed, a small bowl tipped over, spilling a puddle of custard. No one admitted to it, yet all eyes darted suspiciously at Andrew, who protested his innocence with such exaggerated gestures that it drew further attention. Miss Marple, sitting quietly, noted the guilty posture of someone else entirely, Miss Clara, who had turned away for a moment and had flushed in the firelight. After dinner, Miss Marple found herself alone with the vicar's wife, Mrs. Linton, who had come to offer comfort and prayers. She confided that the household had been unusually secretive lately. "There's been talk of old grievances resurfacing," she whispered, "arguments over land, property, inheritances, and even old letters. People are afraid to speak, yet everyone knows everything." Miss Marple nodded. Fear, she knew, often concealed more than the truth. By the evening the snow had deepened, and a fierce wind rattled the windows. Miss Marple returned to Rose Cottage to reflect. She laid out her observations in a careful pattern, connecting movements, motives, and hidden desires. Each person in Foxglove House had reason to wish Sir Reginald ill, or at least to profit from his absence. Yet none of these facts alone explained how a simple fall could result in death under circumstances so strangely neat. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden knock at the door. It was Ellen Briggs, the housemaid, her face pale and alarmed. "Miss Marple," she said breathlessly, "there's been another incident." Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted. "Another?" "Yes, ma'am, in the stables. Someone has been tampering with the horses. Nothing serious yet, but it seems deliberate. Some of the grooms think it might be connected to the letter or the fall." Miss Marple thanked her and closed the door. The wind rattled against the windows as she contemplated the latest development. A fall, a blackmail letter, a minor sabotage in the stables. Clearly, the threads were converging, and someone in that house, or close to it, was orchestrating events with careful precision. She sipped her tea and mused. In her experience, when there were so many misleads, the truth often lay in the smallest, most overlooked detail. A careless glance, a slip of language, a pattern remembered from some long, forgotten case could unravel it all. And Miss Marple had a very good memory indeed. Christmas morning dawned cold and clear over Foxglove End. The snow, crisp and sparkling in the early light, softened the edges of the village and lent it an almost festive charm, yet beneath the beauty, tensions simmered like coals under ash. Miss Marple, wrapped in her shawl, walked slowly through the crisp snow toward Foxglove House, her mind deliberately methodical. Today, she intended, she would begin to assemble the scattered fragments of observation into a coherent whole. Her first stop was the hall, where the staircase, the site of Sir Reginald's tragic fall, loomed in silent accusation. She studied the balustrade, the carpet, the small decorative objects that might have been displaced. There was nothing overtly amiss, yet the faint scuff marks on the polished floor told a story invisible to most eyes, the trajectory of a fall, perhaps aided by subtle interference. It was enough to suggest accident, yet enough also to suggest design. Miss Clara Hawthorne entered, her face pale and determined. "Miss Marple," she said, I wanted to speak with you, it is all so confusing." Miss Marple nodded gently. "It is often so. Perhaps we might review what we know together." Clara hesitated, then spoke. "There were arguments. Father Sir Reginald had been strict, sometimes harsh, but he was also careful. He never left anything to chance. That is why this fall is so shocking." Miss Marple leaned back in her chair and considered the young woman. "And the letter," she said softly, "do you know anything of it?" Clara's expression changed. A flicker of fear, or was it relief, passed over her features. Yes, it was troubling. Someone threatened to reveal something about the family, something from the past. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "And who might have known enough to write it?" Clara hesitated. I don't know. That is why we all suspected each other. It was clever, too clever to be merely random." With that, Miss Marple rose and took her leave, heading toward the study to examine the papers herself. The room bore the faint scent of tobacco and polished wood. Miss Marple ran her fingers over the desk and its papers, noting minute details, the placement of the letter, the pen's position, even a faint indentation on the blotter that suggested a previous draft had been discarded. Each small clue added weight to her thoughts. She reflected on Leonard Pike's behaviour, noting his quiet vigilance, the small tension in his jaw, and the careful avoidance of certain topics. He was loyal, yes, but loyalty could conceal complicity. Miss Marple also recalled the conflicting statements, Andrew's nervous movements, Mrs. Morley's thinly veiled grievance, and the subtle evasions of Miss Clara herself. By late afternoon, Miss Marple had returned to Rose Cottage, carrying a small notebook filled with observations. She settled before the fire, drawing together the threads she had gathered over the last several days. Patterns emerged. The fall, while appearing accidental, aligned almost perfectly with certain human behaviours. The blackmail letter suggested knowledge of family secrets. yet the language indicated intimate familiarity, someone who had lived with or near the Hawthorns. The disturbance in the stables indicated misdirection, an attempt to shift suspicion. The minor custard spill at dinner, the small gesture, revealed more than anyone could have suspected, a silent signal of agitation, of a momentary slip in control. Then, quietly, Miss Marple considered the relationships once more. The family tree, the movements on the evening before the fall, the conversations, the arguments, they pointed to a single conclusion, and yet one that required careful attention to detail. Motives alone were insufficient. The method, the timing, the subtle misleads, all had to align. She recalled Mrs. Peake's report of Andrew carrying something small and shiny, and the cook's remark about voices on the corridor late at night. She recalled the way Miss Clara had turned away when the custard fell, and the glance that betrayed a fleeting tension. And then, finally, she understood. It was not a crime of passion, nor a crime of sudden anger. It was deliberate, executed with careful planning, and an intimate knowledge of the household. The perpetrator had relied on the apparent routine of Sir Reginald's habits, his predictable movements, and the trust inherent in family life. The fall had been staged to look natural, to exploit a minor flaw in the evening's arrangements. The blackmail letter was designed to mislead, to distract attention, and perhaps to heighten fear. Miss Marple smiled faintly, a touch of satisfaction warming her heart. The pattern was clear. That evening she requested the presence of the household in the drawing-room at Foxglove House. Candles flickered, throwing soft shadows over the faces of the assembled family and staff. The atmosphere was tense, each individual aware that something significant was about to be revealed. "Thank you all for coming," Miss Marple began. Her voice was calm, deliberate, yet carried that subtle authority which compelled attention. "I have been observing, reflecting, and connecting certain patterns of behaviour." The family exchanged glances. Leonard Pike stood stiffly, Mrs. Morley dabbed at her eyes, Andrew fidgeted, and Miss Clara's composure trembled slightly. Miss Marple continued. "Sir Reginald's death was tragic, yes, yet it was not entirely accidental. There are clues, small though they may be, which point to deliberate interference. The trajectory of the fall, the disturbances in the household, and the blackmail letter all form a coherent narrative when examined closely." She paused, letting the words sink in. "I believe that one among you took advantage of trust, routine, and a certain complacency to orchestrate a fall that appeared accidental." A hushed murmur rippled through the room. Andrew shifted uncomfortably, and Miss Clara's hands tightened in her lap. Miss Marple's gaze swept over each person, calm yet unyielding. "The person responsible," she said softly, "is someone who knew the family well, observed habits, and anticipated movements. Someone whose composure allowed them to conceal their anxiety behind apparent calm, and, most tellingly, someone whose motive was closely tied to financial interest, an inheritance, an allowance, or a stake in Sir Reginald's affairs." The room was silent. Even the servants seemed to hold their breath. Miss Marple turned her gaze to Miss Clara Hawthorn. "Clara, I am afraid that the combination of circumstances points most directly to you. The moments of agitation, the evasions, and the subtle misdirection all cohere into a pattern. The custard incident, the avoidance of the stables, the knowledge of the letter, all these were small but telling signals." Clara's eyes widened, a flicker of fear and relief mingling. Miss Marple's next words were gentle but firm. "I do not accuse lightly. I only observe that accidents, real or staged, leave traces. Traces which, with patience and care, can be read by someone familiar with human nature." She allowed the pause to linger. Each person in the room felt the weight of her quiet authority, and in that stillness the truth of Foxglove End became undeniable and the path to justice clear. The following morning Foxglove End awoke to a sky the colour of pale slate. Snow still lay in thick drifts across the village green, muffling footsteps and softening the outlines of the cottages. Yet within Foxglove House tension was palpable. Miss Marple had requested the presence of the entire household once more, and this time there would be no polite avoidance, no delicate deflections. The truth, she knew, must be spoken plainly if order and decorum were to be restored. The drawing-room, illuminated by candles and the soft light of the morning, seemed almost theatrical in its stillness. Miss Clara Hawthorne, Andrew, Mrs. Morley, and Leonard Pike sat in their accustomed places, their faces revealing fatigue, apprehension, and, in some cases, guilt. Ellen Briggs and the cook, though standing discreetly near the doorway, observed with keen interest, as did Mrs. Trent, who had been invited by Miss Marple to witness the culmination of her careful deductions. Miss Marple rose slowly, her hands folded in front of her, and began, "Yesterday I spoke of patterns that reveal truths when closely examined. Today I wish to outline the sequence of events that led to Sir Reginald Hawthorne's unfortunate fall, and the person responsible." She paused to let the weight of her words settle. Sir Reginald was a man of predictable habits, careful and precise. He retired early, took a glass of brandy before bed, and always used the staircase with caution. Yet he fell. Was it an accident? Superficially, yes. But when we examine the surrounding circumstances, a different picture emerges. Miss Marple turned slightly, indicating the staircase and then the study. A blackmail letter was discovered, intended to frighten Sir Reginald. It was written by someone with intimate knowledge of the family's private affairs. The handwriting, the phrasing, and the references to past incidents reveal that it could only have come from a person very close to household. She allowed the room to absorb this, then continued. Further, there were disturbances that seemed trivial at first, minor spills, unusual movements in the stables, but each of these was deliberately arranged to mislead and to distract attention from the true sequence of events. Andrew Hawthorne shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Mrs. Morley dabbed at her eyes, and Leonard Pike's expression remained calm yet attentive. Miss Marple's gaze swept over the assembly and then rested on Miss Clara Hawthorne. "Clara, it is clear to me that the combination of motives, opportunity, and subtle manipulation points in your direction. You wished to secure your father's estate for yourself, or at least to prevent your brother from acquiring more than you believed fair. You knew of his habits, his evening routine, and the particularities of the staircase. You sent the blackmail letter, anonymously of course, to heighten tension and create confusion. And then, taking advantage of a brief moment when Sir Reginald was descending the stairs after the argument, you applied just enough force, gentle but decisive, to cause the fall. Clara's hands trembled in her lap. I didn't mean, I didn't know it would." Miss Marple nodded gently. "Of course, often such actions are not premeditated in the sense of malice, but calculated to influence, to gain advantage. Your anxiety, your gestures, your fleeting evasion of attention, these are the traces that betray a carefully concealed truth." Andrew gasped. "Clara, you shush," Miss Marple said softly. "We must understand, not condemn without reflection. Yet the pattern is undeniable. The custard spill at dinner, for instance, an innocent mishap to most, was in fact a moment of distraction, a small misstep you failed to anticipate. The tampering with the stables, too, served as a red herring, designed to divert suspicion away from the central act." Mrs. Morley's voice trembled. "But why, Clara, why such measures?" "To protect myself," Clara admitted, tears streaming. I feared my brother would take more than was mine, and father was. He was so unyielding. I did not mean for him to die. It was supposed to look like an accident, just enough to scare him into compliance. Miss Marple inclined her head. Indeed, and yet, even carefully constructed schemes leave traces. That is what we have observed. Leonard Pike, standing silently beside the fireplace, finally spoke. Miss Marple, your deductions are remarkable, as always, yet it is difficult to believe that such a tragic event could stem from what many would consider a minor desire for advantage. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Human nature is rarely simple, Mr. Pike. Small desires, acted upon with subtle precision, can have consequences far beyond intention. The important task now is to restore order and ensure that such consequences are managed appropriately. Inspector Mallory, who had arrived quietly during the explanation, stepped forward. Clara Hawthorne, he said, I must take you into formal custody for questioning and further proceedings. However, the evidence has been thoroughly considered, and Miss Marple's observations have been invaluable. Clara nodded, resigned. I understand. Miss Marple turned to the remaining family members. The most difficult aspect of our lives is often that which we seek to conceal. Yet, in a community such as Foxglove End, the truth has a way of emerging quietly, like the first snowdrops in spring. After the formalities, Miss Marple spent the afternoon in Rose Cottage with Mrs. Trent, reflecting on the resolution. The village was slowly returning to its peaceful routine. The bells of St. Bartholomew's rang once more, announcing services and calling parishioners to morning prayers. Snow continued to fall softly, muffling sound and lending the village an almost magical serenity. You see, Jane, Mrs. Trent said, settling by the fire, even after all this trouble, life goes on. People will gossip, of course, but there is a sense that order has been restored. Miss Marple nodded. Yes, Eliza, yet we must never underestimate the small signs, the gestures, the glances, the tiniest inconsistencies. Often they reveal more than words ever could. In the days following, the Hawthorne estate began to reconcile itself to the events. Andrew, chastened and reflective, resolved to behave with more decorum, while Mrs. Morley, though still grieving, found a measure of peace in knowing that the truth had come to light. Leonard Pike resumed his duties, careful as ever, though now with the full awareness of the consequences of misjudging human nature. Miss Clara, meanwhile, faced the repercussions of her actions with a mix of sorrow and understanding. The village, ever forgiving when the truth was known, gradually accepted that her intentions, while misguided, were not born of cruelty. In Foxglove End, it seemed, even tragedy could be tempered by comprehension and the gentle workings of human conscience. By the following week, preparations for Christmas continued. The church fete proceeded with the customary cheer, the Women's Institute completed its mince pies, and the villagers of Foxglove End found comfort in routine and tradition. Miss Marple, seated once more in her armchair by the window of Rose Cottage, reflected on the curious intersection of human ambition, fear, and the desire to protect one's own interests. She sipped her tea, eyes scanning the peaceful snow-covered green. Villagers bustled along the lanes, carrying parcels and trimming wreaths. Yet in her mind lingered the delicate balance between appearances and reality, the subtle signals that, if observed with patience and understanding, revealed truths far deeper than any outward show. Patterns, she murmured softly to herself, always patterns, and once you see them clearly, you understand the heart of things. The snow fell gently, the church bells tolled, and Foxglove End, for all its hidden complexities, settled into the quiet warmth of Christmas once more.